Next, we have Leslie Sturmer, continuing the oyster mortality discussion with Florida's off-bottom aquaculture industry and a study that she did. This will move you forward. This is your pointer. I'll use, this is forward.
Nope, I need to use this.
No. Oh, that won't work. Will this forward her talk? That will? Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
I have to adjust.
There you go.
I have older eyes,
All
so I cannot read this. So sorry. It's nice to hear from these younger graduate students, but us older folks. All right, so I'd like to first of all, I'm Leslie Sturmer, and good morning. I'd like to recognize the rest of the project team, Andy Kane, Ed Phillips, Eric Lovestrand, and Holden Harris. I gave the Florida report yesterday, but I'll quickly summarize. Oyster culture in Florida is a relatively new industry, but one that's rapidly growing by the numbers, over 100 or 125 certified growers operating on 400 plus acres of water column leases in 12 coastal counties, most of that located on the west coast of Florida, and production peaked at 4.9 million last year. And over 50% of that production associated, oops, well, this is going to be tricky. Okay, with over, I got it. It was a lot of food and drink last night, and I don't think it was in that order. But anyway, so with most of that production, or 50% of that production coming from those two panhandle counties, Franklin and McCullough. And I don't know, yeah?
That's what I was trying to help
I know, what's going on here?
I got you.
I know.
Where do you want to be? You want to be here?
Keep going, yeah.
No.
See something
here's your McCullough.
Yeah, I know.
And now you want to be on this one, right?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Maybe I should go back to school. I don't know. Okay, so there's many challenges that this new industry has faced. I don't need to read those to you, but this study addresses recent unexplained oyster mortalities experienced by growers in late spring, early summer. At some of these lease areas, the mortalities are reported at up to 50 or 90%, not at all lease areas, primarily triploid oysters, you've already heard that, and most of them reaching market size. Well, that's really... So industry began discussion about these mortality events, first in Florida at an oyster growers meeting just about 2 years ago in January, and that was followed by a regional Gulf of Mexico growers workshop, which experts from several universities then talked about what they knew, didn't know, sought industry input to go ahead and determine priorities for future work. So this pilot study was initiated. We had some funding come through University of Florida internally, so we were able to initiate this pilot study to determine basic but key relationships between production, health of cultured oysters, and environmental factors. So the objectives were threefold: to monitor oyster growth and survival at 2 commercial lease areas, to examine water quality parameters and phytoplankton abundance, and assess prevalence and severity of shell parasitism and Dermo disease. So we were able to identify commercial farms in those 2 counties to be involved in the study, 2 farms located in Alligator Harbor in Franklin County, and the other 2 in Oyster Bay in the adjoining county, Wakulla. Seed were produced at Auburn University Shellfish Lab, 2 triploid lines, one produced from the traditional Louisiana tetraploid stocks and the other from the newly created Florida tetraploid stocks. So these were half siblings, meaning they shared the maternal stocks. We were not able to also bring in the diploid line from that because of Florida restrictions. This did allow for the evaluation and performance of 2 genetic lines. Seed were nursed in Florida to an R12 size. So seed were distributed to growers in late September of that year, each receiving 1,000 of each of those lines at each location. Average size at stock was 21 millimeters, shell height for Florida, 19 for Louisiana, both averaging 1.4 grams in weight. Deployed in 9mm Vexar bags. Growers maintained these oysters in floating bags, cages, They did aerial drive for desiccation, but no tumbling. So we initiated sampling 4 months post-deployment. That was in late January, and then bi-monthly thereafter until they reached the targeted harvest size for this study, which was 70 to 75 millimeters shell height, or 3 inches. So there were a total of 3 sample periods for Alligator Harbor because the harvest occurred in late May, 4 sample periods for Oyster Bay with the harvest in mid-July. Continuous monitoring of temperature, salinity, measuring shell height and whole wet weight each sample period, counting live dead oysters for survival. Additional metrics at harvest, won't report here. Each sample period, we also had oysters assessed for health, and then starting in March and running through July, which is typically the time we find these unexplained mortality events, water was collected, preserved weekly, and then 2 sets per month analyzed for phytoplankton biomass. Looking at water temperature, both sites, Oyster Bay and Alligator Harbor, are similar, obviously declining over the winter months and increasing throughout the rest of the grow-out period following expected seasonal patterns. Now, the oysters at Oyster Bay did go into June and July, and that average water temperature was 84.5. I can't read that far. But interesting note after listening to Kayla's talk that over this culture period, none of those temperatures exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Looking at salinity, Alligator Harbor is a harbor, so those salinities are high with very little variation and average salinities ranging from 30 to 28 over the culture period. Oyster Bay, lower salinities, and again ranging over the culture period from 25 at the start down to about 18. I don't know that. It's just waving way too much to read it. All right, so let's look at growth in terms of shell height. The results for Alligator Harbor are on the left, Oyster Bay on the right. The orange bars represent the Florida stocks, the blue the Louisiana stocks. So that target harvest size of 75 was reached at the end of sample period 2 for Alligator Harbor, or after 6 months. We kept the oysters there for an additional 2 months to observe performance under higher water temperatures. Now at Alligator Harbor, it took an additional 3.4 months, or a total of 9.4 months to reach that target size. Greatest growth over that first sample period in Alligator Harbor of 0.38 millimeters per day. I think that's some of the highest growth rates you can find in the Gulf of Mexico literature. In terms of growth, at both sites, and you'll see that Florida trips are much larger, but there were no significant differences with the Louisiana triploids. Looking at whole wet weight, the graphs are set up the same here. At that harvest size, in the sample period 2 at Alligator Harbor, the average whole weight was 39 grams and then doubled in weight after the next 2 months. You see the same trends there for Oyster Bay, where the greatest growth rates were over the last sample periods with warmer water temperatures. And at those last 2 sample periods, you do see significant differences between the Florida trips and Louisiana trips. Looking at mortality, the bars at the end, below in each graph, that represents the interval mortalities over the sample periods. The curves above, the lines above, are the cumulative mortality over time. So you see over the first 2 sample periods for both locations, negligible mortality, less than 2%. By the end of the sample period, and that would have been the end of May in Alligator Harbor, those mortalities are increasing to, and I can't read that far. Somebody read that for me, Bill. 26 to 30% mortality there. At that same sample period down at the bottom for Oyster Bay, you have 8% for the Florida trips and 13% for the Louisiana trips. And then they did double in mortality over the next sample period. But again, significant differences between those two lines at Oyster Bay over those two sample periods, with lower mortality obtained for the Florida triploids. Looking at average values for phytoplankton biomass, again, Alligator Harbor on the top, Oyster Bay below, 4.5 times the average biomass at Alligator Harbor versus Oyster Bay. The red peaks are of dinoflagellates. There were 5 major species that dominated that, well below those levels that are typically associated with harmful algal blooms in other ecosystems. The dominant group of phytoplankton was diatoms, and that's great because that's considered a very positive feature in food webs and certainly for bivalve food. And that was the major composition in Alligator Harbor at 60% and about 40% at Oyster Bay, the rest of the biomass being associated with nanoplankton species. Looking at shell parasitism prevalence, which is the number of observations of tubes, excavations, or blisters, that increased from 57% to 81% over the sample periods, and this is for all stocks and locations. Severity was relatively mild, those values ranging from 0.4 to 0.9 over the grow-out period, both increased with size and age. Looking at Dermo disease, this is the weighted prevalence, the prevalence being whether hypnospores are present or not in the sample times severity. That's the number of hypnospores in that sample. So weighted prevalence was less than 1 on a scale of 0 to 5, again for all sample periods and locations, and that really is a relatively mild infection. There were differences in stocks by each sample period, but they were not significant. So let's sum this up. In terms of growth relationships, a generalized linear model framework was used to examine how environmental health and site factors affected these oyster responses. Shell growth rates were significantly affected by sample period, location, and their interaction. At Alligator Harbor, the rate was higher at first, whereas the higher rates were observed at Oyster Bay at the latter sample periods. Salinity influenced growth with no effect from temperature, health, or stocks. Looking at the growth relationships for whole wet weight, Alligator Harbor had a higher growth rates compared to Oyster Bay. Rates at both sites increased significantly over the latter sample periods. That effect was 3 to 5 times greater than differences between those locations. Higher temperatures and higher salinities affected weight gain. No effects from health indices. Stock influenced wet gain at Oyster Bay, with Florida trips having significantly higher rates than Alligator Harbor. Sum up the mortality relationships. Those rates increased over time, and sample period was certainly the strongest effect observed. Oyster Bay had lower mortality compared to Alligator Harbor over the latter sample periods, with a significant interaction between that location and sample period. We saw no effects from dermo or shell parasitism. Water salinities and higher salinities observed in the water temperatures certainly influenced mortality. Florida triploids demonstrated lower mortality rates than the Louisiana trips, and these differences between genetic stocks indicate the potential to develop a line with higher resistance to environmental stressors and mortality events. And that wraps it up. I do want to thank our participating growers and the funding source through UF-IFAS seeded. Oh, don't even.
Any questions for Leslie?
Yeah. What's my eyesight score?
I think it's certainly interesting because I know with Kayla's stuff that was using the Louisiana line, so I think there's a question back there actually, Beth. But I think looking at some of those mortality rates and looking at the tetraploid contribution, I think is a valuable direction to go.
Thank you. I just am checking to see that I heard this right. Kayla and Mary both seem to say that higher temperatures plus lower salinity increased mortality.
So
And Leslie said higher salinity and higher temperatures correlated.
I didn't say that. The data said that. So I know. And I was wondering if somebody would pick up that.